The morning sun spilled through the towering glass windows of the airport, casting golden streaks across the polished floors as passengers hurried to their gates. Among them walked Ethan Cole, a sharply dressed corporate executive whose confidence bordered on arrogance. He moved with the air of someone accustomed to control, the kind of man who believed the world should adjust to his schedule. His silver wristwatch glinted under the light as he checked the time impatiently, muttering under his breath about inefficiency. He had a major deal waiting in New York, a partnership that could elevate his company's standing. And in his mind, everyone else was merely a variable in his path to success. As he approached the boarding gate for Flight 247, his assistant, Jason, trailed behind with 2 briefcases and a folder packed with documents. "Sir, the flight's boarding now. We're in first class," Jason informed him cautiously, knowing Ethan's temper all too well. "Finally," Ethan snapped, brushing past him. "Let's hope the crew at least knows how to do their job." His tone dripped with entitlement, and several passengers in the vicinity exchanged looks of discomfort. Ethan was used to such reactions. In fact, he reveled in them. It was power he could feel, in his voice, in his posture, in the way others flinched when he spoke sharply. Once aboard, Ethan settled into his wide leather seat in first class, glancing around with an expression that suggested he was evaluating the worth of everyone around him. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, helping passengers stow luggage and offering polite smiles. That was when she appeared, Clara Wells, the lead flight attendant for the flight. She was composed, elegant, and radiated a calm authority that seemed out of place among the usual bustle. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, her uniform immaculate, and her tone perfectly balanced between warmth and professionalism. As she approached Ethan's seat, he barely looked up from his phone. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard. May I offer you a drink before takeoff?" she asked kindly. Ethan smirked without glancing at her. "Just make sure it's strong." "I'll need it to survive this circus," he muttered, his tone half joking but laced with condescension. Clara smiled politely, clearly used to handling difficult passengers, and responded calmly, "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." Jason, seated beside him, shot a wary glance, silently begging his boss to tone down his attitude. But Ethan ignored him, scrolling through emails and shaking his head. Minutes later, Clara returned with a glass of sparkling water and a lemon slice. Ethan frowned. "I said strong." "This isn't strong," he said curtly, his tone low but cutting. "Sir, we're still on the ground," she explained gently. "We'll be serving alcohol once we're airborne." Her voice was respectful, steady, the mark of someone who had dealt with far worse. But Ethan, impatient as always, gave a dismissive scoff. "Rules, rules, rules, typical." He turned back to his screen, muttering, "No wonder service keeps going downhill." Clara's expression didn't change. She simply nodded and walked away, yet something in her composure unsettled him. It wasn't submission or irritation, and it was confidence, a quiet strength that made her untouchable to his arrogance. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Ethan reclined slightly, adjusting his seatbelt. He looked around, noticing how other passengers interacted with Clara and her team. All of them treated her with respect, and she reciprocated with genuine care. There was something magnetic about her, though he couldn't quite place it. The flight took off smoothly, the city shrinking below them as clouds enveloped the windows in soft white light. The calm hum of the engines filled the cabin. Clara moved effortlessly down the aisle, checking on passengers, her presence commanding quiet respect. When she returned to Ethan's row, she noticed Jason looking uneasy. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked gently. Jason smiled politely. "Yes, thank you. Just a bit of turbulence in the meeting schedule," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Ethan rolled his eyes. "He's nervous about nothing. I've got everything under control, as usual," he said loudly enough for her to hear. Clara's eyes flickered briefly, the faintest trace of amusement or recognition flashing across them, but she said nothing. Hours passed, and the flight settled into routine. Meals were served, passengers relaxed, and conversations flowed quietly. Ethan, however, remained restless. He snapped at Jason over a misplaced file and sighed audibly when a passenger reclined their seat too far. He thrived on control, and at 30,000 feet, control was something he didn't have. As Clara passed by again, Ethan stopped her with a wave of his hand. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "Can you tell me how much longer until we land? Some of us have actual work to do. Clara glanced at the flight timer and replied, "About 2 hours and 15 minutes, sir. Would you like me to inform the crew to prepare your requested documents for review?" Her tone was polite but slightly firm, enough to remind him that professionalism worked both ways. Ethan narrowed his eyes trying to read her. There was something unusually self-assured about her, almost like she wasn't just another flight attendant. "You take your job very seriously," he remarked, his voice tinged with mockery. "Most people in your line of work don't." Jason's jaw tightened. He knew that was crossing a line. But Clara remained calm, her expression unreadable. "We take pride in what we do, sir. Every role matters when it comes to keeping people safe and comfortable," she replied evenly. Ethan gave a dry chuckle. "That's a cute philosophy." Before Jason could intervene, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing a brief patch of turbulence ahead. Clara excused herself, securing the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The plane shook lightly as it entered the rough air, but Clara's calm voice reassured passengers to remain seated. Ethan, though visibly annoyed, noticed how her presence seemed to steady everyone around her, including himself. When the turbulence passed, she moved through the cabin again, checking seatbelts, offering smiles, and ensuring everyone felt at ease. Ethan caught himself watching her for longer than he intended. There was something about her, not just professionalism but confidence that came from authority, the kind of presence that couldn't be taught in customer service training. After the turbulence, the cabin lights dimmed for the evening. Clara made her rounds again, offering drinks. "Would you like that drink now, sir?" she asked with a faint smile. Ethan smirked. Finally, maybe this flight can redeem itself. She handed him a small bottle and a glass, still polite but clearly unshaken by his tone. "Enjoy, sir," she said simply. As she turned to leave, he called out, "You know, you're surprisingly calm for someone in customer service. Ever think of aiming higher?" His words were meant as a jab, but Clara paused, then turned back with a subtle, knowing smile. "Sometimes, sir," she replied. "It's better to start where others underestimate you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued but too proud to show it. Jason looked down, sensing that there was more to her than met the eye. When the flight finally began its descent into New York, Clara made one last check through the cabin. As she approached Ethan's seat, she spoke with her usual calm composure. "Sir, I hope your flight was pleasant despite the small turbulence." Ethan smirked. "It was fine, you did—" "All right," he said, his tone still patronizing. Clara nodded. "I appreciate the feedback, Mr. Cole. We'll see each other again soon." Her words hung in the air longer than they should have. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean, see each other again?" he asked, but she only smiled politely and continued down the aisle. The plane landed smoothly, and as passengers disembarked, Ethan gathered his belongings, his mind replaying her last sentence. Outside the gate, as he and Jason walked through the terminal, Jason whispered, "She said we'd see her again." "Strange, right?" Ethan scoffed. "Probably just being polite. Flight attendants say whatever keeps people calm." But deep down, something about her tone unsettled him, as if she knew something he didn't. That evening, Ethan and Jason arrived at the headquarters of Aurelia Enterprises, where they were scheduled for a major presentation. Ethan had been preparing for this meeting for months. The outcome could determine the future of his company. As they walked into the grand lobby, a hush of luxury greeted them. Marble floors, glass walls, and a golden emblem shining above the reception desk. Jason handed Ethan the final folder as they waited for the executive in charge to arrive. Moments later, the elevator doors opened, and out stepped Clara Wells, now dressed in a sleek navy business suit, her hair neatly pinned, and a calm confidence radiating from her every step. Ethan froze, disbelief etched across his face as she approached with a professional smile. "Mr. Cole," she greeted smoothly. "Welcome to Aurelia Enterprises. I'm Clara Wells, head of global operations. I'll be overseeing your partnership proposal today." Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The same woman he had mocked, dismissed, and patronized at 30,000 feet now stood before him, not as a flight attendant, but as the executive who held his company's fate in her hands. Jason's eyes widened, barely able to contain his shock. Clara extended her hand gracefully. "I trust your flight was comfortable?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes holding his for just a moment longer than necessary. Ethan forced a smile, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of realization. "It was enlightening," he replied softly, unsure of what else to say. Clara's smile deepened ever so slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that the real lesson was just beginning. As the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, Ethan Cole struggled to shake off the lingering unease that Clara's composed demeanor had stirred within him. The memory of her calm authority and subtle confidence haunted him more than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, he felt slightly powerless, and the discomfort gnawed at him, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to. Every time she moved down the aisle, attending to other passengers with effortless grace, he caught himself observing her, almost unconsciously noting the precision in her movements, the polite firmness in her tone, the quiet respect she commanded without a word of confrontation. Jason, seated beside him, noticed Ethan's unusual silence. "Sir, are you okay? You've been quiet for the last 30 minutes, he whispered nervously. Ethan shook his head, forcing a chuckle. "Just thinking, that's all. Nothing serious." Yet he knew it was more than thinking. It was the first crack in his armor, a subtle realization that his usual arrogance might not hold as firmly in the presence of someone like Clara. She wasn't just efficient. She was intentional, self-assured, and most importantly, she wasn't intimidated by him. That thought alone unsettled him. Minutes later, turbulence hit unexpectedly, shaking the cabin slightly. Passengers murmured nervously, and a few gripped their armrests. Clara moved calmly down the aisle, checking on seatbelts, offering reassuring words, and exuding a serenity that contrasted sharply with Ethan's rising tension. He realized, with a reluctant admiration, that she seemed unshaken by what had thrown him off balance, and it frustrated him more than he wanted to admit. Jason noticed Ethan's frown. "Sir, you're staring again," he said quietly. Ethan waved him off but didn't look away. He couldn't. Clara's presence had a magnetic pull that forced him to acknowledge something he had long ignored. His behavior was often abrasive, dismissive, and rooted in ego. Yet here was someone handling it all with grace and composure. When the turbulence finally subsided, Clara returned to his row with a glass of water and a polite smile. "Is everything all right now, sir?" she asked, her tone both professional and subtly probing. Ethan hesitated, trying to muster his usual arrogance. "Fine," he muttered, "just fine." But his voice lacked conviction. Clara didn't press further. She merely nodded and moved on, leaving him to stew in a rare and unfamiliar reflection. As the flight continued, Ethan's attention was drawn to the way Clara interacted with other passengers. She remembered names, anticipated needs, and handled requests swiftly without losing composure. Each interaction was precise yet warm, firm yet kind, and it gradually eroded the pedestal Ethan had placed himself upon. He had never considered that a flight attendant could command such authority simply through presence, skill, and intent. He found himself comparing her behavior to his own, noting the sharp contrast between his tendency to dominate and her ability to influence without confrontation. The realization struck him uncomfortably. Humility and competence, when combined, wielded a kind of power that arrogance could never achieve. He couldn't dismiss it, and that made him increasingly uneasy. Halfway through the flight, a minor incident occurred. A passenger in business class, flustered and confused, had accidentally spilled coffee on an adjacent seat. Clara responded immediately, calmly instructing another flight attendant to handle cleanup while she reassured the passenger, diffusing tension with a combination of empathy and authority. Ethan watched, silently impressed but also irritated. He couldn't understand why he felt a mix of admiration and irritation at the same time. Jason noticed Ethan's conflicted expression. "Sir, maybe you should relax a bit. She seems to have everything under control," he suggested. Ethan snapped slightly. "I know she's in control, I just can't believe it." The word surprised even him. He hated that he was begrudgingly acknowledging someone's capability, and worse, that it wasn't in the way he was accustomed to wielding power. Later, during the meal service, Ethan attempted to assert control in his typical fashion, issuing a curt remark about the timing of service. Clara responded with her usual calm professionalism, correcting the situation without a trace of defensiveness. For the first time, Ethan felt a genuine sense of being managed, overseen, and, most unnerving of all, corrected by someone he had assumed was subordinate to him. He realized that her authority wasn't derived from title or ego. It came from competence, presence, and a confidence that demanded respect without demanding it explicitly. It was a lesson in itself, one he couldn't ignore. Jason kept glancing at him, sensing the internal conflict. Ethan's pride warred with his growing respect for her, creating a tension he had never experienced. Hours passed, and the plane finally began its descent into New York. Ethan's mind churned with an uneasy mix of reflection and frustration. He replayed every interaction, every instance where Clara had managed the cabin effortlessly while maintaining calm authority. He realized reluctantly that he had underestimated her from the very beginning. He had assumed her role was limited, her influence minimal, but her actions had demonstrated control, foresight, and leadership in ways that he had never anticipated. The irony was undeniable. A flight attendant, a role he had casually dismissed, had taught him more about composure, influence, and quiet authority than any corporate seminar or executive meeting ever had. As the cabin prepared for landing, Clara approached Ethan one last time. "Sir, I hope your flight was comfortable. We'll be landing shortly," she said, her voice polite but carrying an unmistakable undertone of confidence. Ethan paused, studying her face, noticing the subtle strength in her expression, the calm in her posture, and the unwavering composure she maintained despite his occasional rudeness. For the first time he felt small, not humiliated exactly, but confronted with the undeniable truth that he had misjudged someone based on superficial assumptions. Clara's professionalism had exposed the flaws in his own arrogance, forcing him to reflect on his behavior and attitudes in ways he had long avoided. When the plane touched down smoothly, and passengers began to disembark, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and discomfort. He had survived the flight, yet he realized that he hadn't merely traveled from one city to another. He had undergone a subtle but profound confrontation with his own ego. As he collected his belongings and followed Jason down the jetway, he caught one last glimpse of Clara, assisting another passenger with a calm smile. Something in the way she moved, poised and authoritative, triggered a sinking realization in Ethan's chest. This wasn't over. Whatever he had experienced in those hours at 30,000 feet had planted a seed of change, and he had no idea how far-reaching it would become. By the time he exited into the bustling New York terminal, his mind was racing. Clara had managed to teach him without raising her voice, scolding, or asserting dominance in the way he expected, a lesson about presence, authority, and humility. He thought back to the subtle moments, how she handled turbulence with calm, diffused tension, managed spills with grace, and corrected his minor complaints without condescension. Each instance had chipped away at his assumptions about power and status, leaving him with the uncomfortable awareness that he had a lot to learn. Jason noticed the pensive expression on Ethan's face. "Sir, are you okay? You look different," he said tentatively. Ethan shook his head, forcing a smirk he didn't feel. "Different isn't the word, Jason. Enlightened, maybe. Or maybe just reminded that there's a lot I don't see until it's right in front of me." Jason frowned, unsure what to say, but sensed that his boss had just undergone a rare moment of reflection. That evening, Ethan arrived at the offices of Cole Enterprises, mentally preparing for the next phase of his day, a high-stakes meeting with investors. But he couldn't shake the image of Clara, poised, calm, and confident, walking down the aisle, serving passengers with an authority that had eclipsed his own expectations. He had underestimated someone based solely on their title, their position in the social hierarchy of the flight, and he realized that assumption had been a mistake, a humbling one. As he prepared documents and reviewed presentations, he couldn't stop thinking, what if Clara was right? What if true authority didn't require loud commands, aggressive control, or the assertion of power, but instead demanded competence, empathy, and quiet confidence? Hours later, the office doors closed behind him, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He felt a strange mixture of irritation, admiration, and curiosity. Irritation because he had been humbled, admiration because he recognized skill and presence where he had dismissed it, and curiosity because he now wondered how much more there was to learn from someone like Clara. Little did he know, the lesson wasn't over, not by a long shot. The flight had been just the beginning. The real test, The true confrontation with his assumptions would come soon enough, and it would challenge not only his ego, but the very foundation of how he approached people, leadership, and respect. And somewhere deep in his mind a quiet voice whispered that Clara's presence was no coincidence, that her role in his journey was far more significant than he could yet comprehend. By the time the plane touched down at New York's bustling airport, Ethan Cole's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, pride, and the undeniable realization that he had misjudged Clara Wells. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Ethan remained seated, fingers drumming nervously on the armrest, trying to process the subtle but profound lesson he had experienced in the air. The arrogance that had once fueled his confidence now felt brittle, as though every smirk and dismissive comment he had made during the flight had been quietly catalogued in Clara's steady, observant mind. Jason, ever the loyal assistant, gave him a subtle nudge. "Sir, shall we get moving?" "The cab's waiting," he whispered, sensing Ethan's uncharacteristic hesitation. Ethan finally nodded, standing slowly, his gaze momentarily returning to Clara, who was assisting another passenger with the same effortless grace and authority that had unsettled him all flight. Something about her calm composure, the ease with which she commanded attention without demanding it, stuck in his mind, a lesson in humility, power, and perception he had never been exposed to before. As they made their way through the crowded terminal, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the countless minor humiliations he had unknowingly suffered on that flight, the turbulence he had reacted to, the spilled coffee he had criticized, the way Clara had corrected his demands with politeness and quiet firmness. Each instance had peeled away at the layers of his ego, leaving him exposed to a truth he had long ignored. Competence and authority were not dictated by title or position alone, but by presence, intelligence, and the ability to influence others without resorting to intimidation. The irony of it struck him sharply. Here was someone he had casually dismissed as subordinate, yet she had demonstrated a level of control, foresight, and professionalism that he, despite years of corporate success, had rarely achieved. The revelation was both humbling and unsettling. Later that day, Ethan arrived at Aurelia Enterprises, the corporate headquarters where his next meeting awaited. The lobby was a grand affair, marble floors gleaming under soft overhead lights, glass panels stretching from floor to ceiling, and the hum of efficient activity filling the space. As he adjusted his tie and prepared mentally for the meeting, Ethan's pulse quickened when he saw Clara Wells emerge from the elevators. Gone was the flight attendant uniform. In its place was a sleek navy business suit, impeccably tailored, her hair styled neatly, her posture radiating authority and confidence. The same woman who had served him coffee, defused turbulence-induced tension, and commanded the cabin's respect at 30,000 feet, now stood before him as the head of global operations, the very person who would oversee the success of his proposal. Ethan froze for a moment, disbelief and awe battling for dominance in his mind. Jason beside him nearly dropped his briefcase, eyes wide as recognition and shock dawned. "Sir, that's her," he whispered. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure, but the smirk that usually adorned his face was replaced by a faint, uncertain frown. Clara's gaze met Ethan's, steady and unflinching. "Mr. Cole, welcome to Aurelia Enterprises," she said, her voice calm, professional, yet carrying a subtle undertone that hinted at the power she had quietly wielded over him earlier. "I'll be overseeing your partnership proposal today." Ethan's throat tightened. The casual arrogance he had carried through countless boardrooms seemed insufficient, trivial, even laughable in her presence. Every instinct screamed at him to assert control, to attempt dominance in the familiar corporate manner. But the memory of her composure, her quiet authority on the flight, restrained him. He realized almost with a jolt that he had underestimated her. Not only underestimated, but perhaps dismissed her in ways that were unprofessional, presumptuous, and above all arrogant. This was the woman who had managed an entire cabin at 30,000 feet while keeping him in check, and now she would scrutinize his business acumen with the same quiet confidence. The meeting began in a state-of-the-art conference room, panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline, sunlight streaming in and illuminating the polished table. Ethan set up his presentation, flipping through slides and reports while Clara observed quietly, occasionally jotting notes. The boardroom was tense. Ethan could feel it. but it was different from any tension he had ever experienced. Here it wasn't fear, nor was it submission. It was scrutiny paired with measured respect, and it unsettled him profoundly. As he began to present his proposal, outlining market projections, revenue streams, and strategic plans, he noticed Clara's keen focus, the slight nods of acknowledgement when data aligned with her expectations, and the subtle furrow of her brow when details required deeper scrutiny. Ethan had faced critical executives before, but never had he encountered someone whose presence alone could hold him accountable for every flaw, every assumption, every misstep, without raising their voice or showing overt dominance. Midway through the presentation, a point of contention arose, a projected revenue model that Clara deemed overly optimistic. Ethan instinctively prepared to defend his position, citing data and market trends, but Clara interrupted politely yet firmly. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate your projections, but I'd like to understand the assumptions behind these numbers more thoroughly. Could you walk us through your methodology?" Her tone was calm, measured, and authoritative. Ethan realized he couldn't rely on charm, intimidation, or corporate jargon. He had to be precise, honest, and transparent. As he explained the assumptions, he felt the subtle but firm presence of someone who expected accuracy and accountability, a presence that mirrored her control on the flight. Each word he spoke was carefully weighed, each argument more deliberate, each projection more rigorously supported. By the end of the presentation, the boardroom atmosphere had shifted. Clara's questions had not only tested his competence but also exposed his tendency toward overconfidence and occasional arrogance. Yet her approach was constructive rather than punitive. She guided, probed, and challenged without belittling. Ethan felt a mix of humility, respect, and a dawning realization. Leadership, influence, and authority were far more nuanced than he had imagined. He had spent years believing power was about asserting dominance, controlling outcomes, and projecting confidence. But Clara had shown him, first in the air and now in the boardroom, that true authority required empathy, precision, and the ability to command respect without demanding it. As the meeting concluded, Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze meeting Ethan's. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. Your proposal is promising, and I look forward to seeing how your team implements these strategies," she said, her voice calm but imbued with undeniable authority. Ethan nodded, swallowing his pride. "Thank you, Ms. Wells. Your feedback is invaluable." Jason let out a small sigh of relief, sensing that his boss had survived the encounter, though changed. Ethan, however, was acutely aware that he had been subtly humbled, and more importantly, enlightened. The lesson he had experienced at 30,000 feet had not ended with the flight. It had evolved into a confrontation with his own assumptions, biases, and approach to leadership. As they walked out of the conference room, Ethan reflected silently. Every gesture, every question, every subtle correction from Clara during the flight and now in the boardroom had been a mirror, showing him not only his strengths but also the arrogance and assumptions that had held him back. For the first time in years, he recognized that leadership was not a function of position or title, but of presence, empathy, and influence, qualities that Clara possessed in abundance. Jason glanced at him cautiously. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful nod. "More than okay, Jason. I've just learned something important today, and I'm not even sure I'm ready to admit all of it yet." Jason's eyes widened, sensing a rare humility in his usually brash boss. Later, as Ethan returned to his office, he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Clara had managed to correct, guide, and influence him without anger, sarcasm, or confrontation, both on the plane and in the boardroom. He realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that her authority did not come from dominance or intimidation, but from competence, presence, and the ability to command respect effortlessly. Every instinct he had relied on to assert power, to control situations, and to intimidate colleagues seemed insufficient now. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that leadership required far more than charisma or strategic acumen. It required empathy, awareness, humility, and the ability to inspire trust. That night, as Ethan sat alone in his office overlooking the city lights, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the arrogance he had carried onto the plane, the dismissive comments he had made, and the subtle lessons that Clara had delivered without raising her voice. He realized that the journey he had begun at 30,000 feet was only just beginning. Clara's presence, her quiet authority, and her unexpected revelation as the person in charge of his business future had left an indelible mark. He knew deep down that he could no longer rely solely on ego and forceful control to navigate the challenges ahead in business, leadership, and life. He would have to embrace humility, empathy, and self-awareness. The lesson was clear. Assumptions based on titles, appearances, or perceived status could be dangerously misleading. True leadership demanded recognition of competence, respect for influence regardless of form, and the courage to confront one's own biases. Ethan felt a quiet determination rising within him, a commitment to internalize these lessons, to grow beyond the narrow confines of his ego, and to approach his role and the people around him with renewed awareness and respect. For the first time, he understood that the flight, which had seemed mundane and routine, had been a carefully orchestrated catalyst for transformation, one he could not ignore, and one that would continue to shape his actions and decisions long after the wheels had touched the ground. Following the boardroom revelation, Ethan Cole's world seemed to tilt in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every instinct that had once guided him, confidence, arrogance, and a sense of superiority, now felt tenuous in Clara Wells's presence. He realized that the woman he had casually dismissed, mocked, and underestimated had become both his evaluator and the standard against which his competence would be measured. As the meeting progressed, Clara's questions were incisive yet subtle, probing deeper than the surface of his proposals, forcing him to justify assumptions he had previously taken for granted. Her calm demeanor and measured responses kept him on edge, but they also demanded that he think clearly, strategically, and honestly. Every answer he provided was scrutinized not only for accuracy, but also for integrity, and he felt a rare sense of vulnerability creeping in, a vulnerability that he had long avoided in professional settings. Jason, observing from a corner, could see the shift in his boss. Ethan's confidence was tempered by respect, and his usual bravado was replaced by careful consideration. It was clear that Clara's presence was altering not just the trajectory of the meeting, but the mindset of the man who had once believed he commanded every room he entered. As the discussion unfolded, Ethan began to notice something that went beyond professional evaluation. Clara's approach to leadership was fundamentally different from his own. While he had spent years asserting authority and controlling outcomes, she relied on influence, empathy, and the ability to inspire trust. Her authority did not scream. It was felt. She acknowledged his points where appropriate, challenged discrepancies thoughtfully, and encouraged collaboration rather than confrontation. In doing so, she created an atmosphere where Ethan had no choice but to engage authentically, to communicate honestly, and to reevaluate the way he perceived leadership and power. Each moment of the meeting was a mirror, reflecting not only the gaps in his approach but also the potential for growth he had neglected in his relentless pursuit of results. Halfway through the session, a critical scenario arose. A flaw in Ethan's market projections was identified. Where in past meetings he might have reacted defensively or attempted to shift blame, Clara's poised intervention forced him to acknowledge the oversight and think critically about the implications. "Mr. Cole," she said softly but firmly, "I see the rationale behind your assumptions, but there may be external factors you haven't fully accounted for. How would you adjust your strategy if these variables shift?" Ethan paused, considering her question carefully. In that instant, he realized that this wasn't about failure or humiliation. It was about learning, adapting, and growing, lessons he had rarely internalized in his previous leadership experiences. Clara's subtle guidance was reshaping his approach from reactionary to reflective, from egocentric to strategic, and from transactional to relational. By the end of the presentation, the boardroom dynamic had transformed. Ethan found himself respecting not only Clara's intellect and leadership style, but also her capacity to cultivate trust and accountability without the need for intimidation. He reflected on the flight that had brought them together, and the small, seemingly mundane interactions that had quietly shifted his perspective. How she had handled turbulence with calm, responded to complaints with patience, and managed the cabin's challenges with unflappable composure was now mirrored in the boardroom. He realized the lessons he had absorbed at 30,000 feet were not limited to the airplane, but applied universally. In leadership, in relationships and in life, humility, empathy, and authority could coexist in ways that produced far more meaningful results than arrogance ever could. After the meeting concluded, Clara offered a final remark, her voice calm and unwavering. "Mr. Cole, your proposal shows promise, and with adjustments, I believe it can achieve the outcomes you've projected. I look forward to working with you to implement these strategies." Ethan, still processing the weight of her words and the implications of the day, nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Wells. Your insight is invaluable." As Clara left the room, he watched her go, feeling a mixture of admiration, humility, and determination. He realized that he had encountered someone whose authority transcended titles and positions, someone whose competence, empathy, and quiet confidence demanded reflection and growth from anyone in her presence. Back in his office, Ethan sat alone, contemplating the profound impact of the day. He thought about his behavior on the flight, his assumptions about Clara's role, and the arrogance he had carried into the boardroom. The realization was sobering. He had underestimated the power of presence, the subtle influence of leadership grounded in empathy, and the importance of respecting competence regardless of perceived status. These lessons were uncomfortable but necessary. They exposed his vulnerabilities while illuminating the path toward more effective, authentic leadership. The seed planted at 30,000 feet had taken root, and now it was growing into a broader understanding of influence, respect, and personal responsibility. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to implement what he had learned. He approached his team differently, prioritizing listening over commanding, collaboration over dictation, and reflection over immediate reaction. Meetings that once felt like arenas for dominance became spaces for discussion, creativity, and collective problem-solving. Employees began responding positively to his new approach, showing increased engagement, trust, and initiative. Ethan found himself surprised by the results. The same team that had previously operated out of obligation or fear now thrived under guidance that balanced authority with empathy. The transformation was subtle yet profound. Productivity increased, morale improved, and he noticed a genuine willingness among team members to contribute ideas without hesitation. One day, as he walked through the office observing his team at work, Ethan recalled the specific moments on the flight where Clara had challenged his assumptions, held him accountable, and guided him without confrontation. He realized that her methods had not been designed to embarrass or assert superiority, but to teach, a lesson delivered with precision, patience, and insight. That realization struck him deeply. Leadership was not about asserting dominance. It was about creating environments where people could excel, trust was cultivated, and growth was prioritized. Clara had demonstrated this effortlessly, first at 30,000 feet and now in the boardroom, and Ethan recognized that her example was one he needed to emulate not just professionally, but personally. As months passed, Ethan's transformation continued. His leadership style evolved to integrate the principles he had witnessed: humility, accountability, and the ability to influence through example rather than force. Challenges that once triggered frustration or impatience were now approached with reflection and problem-solving. His relationships with colleagues deepened, and even his personal interactions outside the office began to shift. He listened more, judged less, and offered guidance with patience and thoughtfulness. The lessons from Clara had transcended the initial flight experience. They had become a foundational part of his approach to life, leadership, and human interaction. Eventually, Ethan and Clara crossed paths again, this time in a collaborative setting involving strategic planning for a major corporate initiative. Their interaction was professional, measured, and mutually respectful. Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude for the lesson, for her mentorship, and for the opportunity to grow as a leader. He realized that the impact of a single flight, a single encounter, could extend far beyond its immediate context, shaping behavior, mindset, and perspective in ways that no conventional training could replicate. Clara's guidance, subtle yet powerful, had catalyzed a transformation that would influence his decisions, his leadership, and his life for years to come. Ethan's reflection on the journey brought him to a deeper understanding. Life often delivers lessons in unexpected ways, And the people who challenge us most profoundly may not hold the positions we assume are important. True authority, he realized, could emerge from the most unassuming sources. And humility, empathy, and competence were far more influential than ego or title. Clara's lesson at 30,000 feet had proven enduring, powerful, and life-changing, shaping not only his career but the man he aspired to become. And as he looked ahead to future challenges, he understood that the real work, the conscious application of the lessons learned, was only just beginning. Months had passed since that fateful flight, yet the memory of Clara Wells's quiet authority lingered in Ethan Cole's mind like a persistent echo, a reminder of the lesson he could never unlearn. Each day since then, he had consciously applied the insights she had instilled both in the boardroom and in the office, yet the real transformation had only begun internally. It wasn't merely about improving productivity or boosting team morale. It was about redefining his understanding of leadership, influence, and the way he engaged with others. Ethan found himself reflecting on the arrogance he had carried onto that flight, the assumptions he had made, and the subtle ways Clara had dismantled them, all without raising her voice, without condescension, without making him feel small. Her method had been surgical, precise, firm, and elegantly respectful, a style of leadership far removed from his previous methods of control and intimidation. He realized that her impact had been so profound precisely because it had been subtle. He had been unaware of how much he had absorbed until he began to see its effects in his own behavior and interactions. At the office, the change in Ethan was evident. Meetings that once resembled arenas of dominance had transformed into spaces for collaboration and open dialogue. He listened actively, solicited feedback, and encouraged creativity, allowing his team to take ownership of solutions rather than merely following instructions. Employees responded with engagement, initiative, and genuine enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the hesitant compliance that had marked his previous approach. Ethan noticed the difference in himself as well. He no longer felt the compulsive need to control every outcome, to assert superiority, or to dominate discussions. Instead, he approached challenges with reflection, empathy, and the understanding that leadership was as much about guidance as it was about decision-making. The internal shift was profound. For the first time, he understood that respect could not be commanded through fear or ego but had to be earned through competence, fairness, and authenticity. One afternoon, as Ethan prepared for another high-stakes meeting with investors, Clara returned to the office, this time in the context of a corporate partnership review. Her presence was calm, composed, and subtly commanding, the same poise that had unsettled him months earlier. She greeted him with a warm, professional smile. "Mr. Cole, it's good to see the progress since our last discussion," she said. Ethan, now more measured and self-aware, returned the greeting with genuine respect rather than the habitual smirk of superiority. "Thank you, Ms. Wells. Your guidance has been invaluable in helping me refine not only the proposal but also my approach to leadership," he admitted. For a moment, he realized how far he had come. That humility, once alien and uncomfortable, was now a natural part of his interactions. Clara's expression remained calm, approving yet understated, reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a mentor witnessing tangible growth in her mentee. During the meeting, Ethan noticed himself responding differently to challenges. Questions that would have previously provoked defensiveness now elicited thoughtful consideration. Critiques were received with gratitude rather than resentment, and alternative perspectives were weighed carefully rather than dismissed outright. He realized that Clara's lessons were not merely procedural or strategic. They were deeply philosophical, shaping his understanding of human interaction, influence, and ethical decision-making. By modeling leadership through presence, empathy, and accountability, she had imparted a lesson that transcended the boundaries of corporate protocol. The subtle yet powerful approach she employed had allowed him to internalize principles he might have resisted if imposed through overt authority or criticism. After the meeting concluded successfully, Ethan reflected privately in his office. He remembered the turbulence on the flight, the spilled coffee, and the minor frustrations that had seemed so significant at the time. He now understood that each of those moments had been opportunities for him to recognize his limitations, confront his arrogance, and embrace growth. Clara's subtle interventions had forced him to examine his reactions, assumptions, and priorities. For the first time, he appreciated the concept of leadership as a continuous journey, rather than a static title or position. It was about learning, adapting, and influencing others positively while maintaining integrity, empathy, and humility. As weeks turned into months, Ethan's transformation became evident not only to himself, but to those around him. His team thrived under his renewed leadership, approaching him with openness and trust rather than caution and deference. Meetings became arenas of collaboration, problem-solving became a shared endeavor, and employees' creativity and engagement flourished. Ethan realized that true influence required more than strategic skill or authority. It required understanding, respect, and the ability to inspire others to achieve their potential. Every success, every small victory now carried a lesson about the balance between confidence and humility, authority and empathy. One afternoon, Clara invited Ethan to a corporate mentorship seminar, a program designed to develop leadership potential across the organization. As he entered the seminar room, he noticed how seamlessly Clara commanded attention, not through volume or aggression, but through presence, competence, and the ability to create trust. Watching her interact with other executives and emerging leaders, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude. He understood that the impact of their initial encounter at 30,000 feet had rippled far beyond that singular flight. It had reshaped his professional identity and his understanding of what it meant to be a leader. The realization filled him with both humility and purpose. By the end of the seminar, Ethan had adopted a new mantra. Leadership was not about proving one's superiority, but about cultivating the potential in others, guiding with wisdom and approaching challenges with empathy and insight. Clara's mentorship had shown him that influence was earned through action, integrity, and the quiet power of example, rather than through authority alone. For Ethan, this marked the culmination of a journey that had begun unexpectedly in the sky, a journey that challenged his assumptions, confronted his ego, and ultimately reshaped the trajectory of his career and personal growth. As the day ended and Ethan left the seminar, he paused to reflect on the remarkable irony of it all. The woman he had once mocked, the flight attendant he had assumed was beneath him, had become the catalyst for profound change in his life. Her quiet strength had taught him lessons about respect, accountability, and the nature of true leadership. Lessons that would remain with him far longer than any corporate strategy or market projection. Ethan understood fully and irrevocably that the path forward was not about maintaining dominance or superiority, but about embodying the principles he had learned, fostering trust and leading with both confidence and humility. Months later, as Ethan prepared for a major international expansion, he glanced at a framed photograph on his desk, a candid image of a smiling Clara aboard that very flight where everything had begun. The sight reminded him of the journey he had undertaken, from arrogance to reflection, from dismissal to respect, and from ego-driven authority to empathetic leadership. He knew that every decision, every interaction, and every choice going forward would be informed by the lessons learned from that day at 30,000 feet. He smiled quietly, a mix of gratitude and determination filling him, recognizing that growth often comes from the most unexpected places, and that humility, when combined with insight, could transform not only one's career but one's life. Ethan's journey had started with a moment of mockery and disbelief, but it concluded with a profound understanding. The true measure of leadership is not in titles, power, or appearances, but in the ability to inspire, guide, and uplift others while remaining self-aware and humble. Clara Wells, the woman he had once underestimated, had imparted a lesson that no seminar, meeting, or corporate manual could have achieved. A lesson of presence, empathy, and authentic authority. And as he prepared to face future challenges, Ethan knew that he carried not just the skills to succeed, but the wisdom to lead with integrity, respect, and purpose. The flight, the revelation, and the mentorship had transformed him, not just as a businessman, but as a person capable of understanding the deeper truths of influence, leadership, and human connection.